The scream came from the linen room, and King Alaric Voss stopped walking before his mind even understood why. He had been heading to the treasury wing to check a shipment ledger, a small task, the kind of thing a king should not even have to think about but always did. The castle was quiet at that hour. Most of the staff had gone to the lower halls for their evening meal. His boots made no sound on the old stone, a habit from years of moving through his own home like a man who still expected an enemy behind every door. The sound came again, not loud, muffled, like someone trying to hold it in. He turned down the narrow servant's stairwell without deciding to. His body simply went, faster than thought, the way a wolf moves before the mind finishes catching up. The door to the linen room was half open. Inside, a young woman named Wren was pressed against the shelving, her arms raised in front of her face, not to fight, only to shield herself. Her uniform was torn at the shoulder, and standing over her, one hand still raised, was his son, Prince Damien. For a moment, nobody in that room moved. Wren saw the king first, and something in her face broke open, relief and terror tangled together so tightly that Alaric would remember that exact expression for the rest of his life. Damien turned a second later, and whatever calm mask he wore in public dropped away entirely. What was left underneath was not shame, it was irritation, the look of a man caught in the middle of something ordinary, something he did not expect to matter. "Father," Damien said, straightening his jacket, as if that alone could undo what had just been seen. "This isn't what it looks like." Alaric did not answer right away. He looked at Wren first. Her hands were shaking. There was a red mark forming along her jaw that had not been there an hour ago, when he had passed her in the hallway and she had curtsied and wished him a good evening in a steady, ordinary voice. "Are you hurt?" he asked her, and his voice was quiet, the same quiet he used before council decisions, the tone every wolf in Blackthorn had learned to fear more than shouting. Wren could not speak. She nodded once, then shook her head, then nodded again, not sure which answer was safe. "You may go," Alaric said to her gently. "No one will punish you for this. I give you my word." She hesitated, glancing at Damien as though checking whether the king's word would hold once she was gone. Then she slipped past both of them and disappeared up the stairs, one hand pressed to her torn sleeve. When she was gone, Alaric turned to his son. "Explain it to me, then," he said, "since it is not what it looks like." Damien's jaw tightened. He was 26 years old, tall like his father, with the same sharp gray eyes that had once made Alaric proud to see reflected back at him. Now those eyes only looked cold. "She was clumsy," Damien said. "She spilled something on me. I raised my voice. That's all this is. You're going to stand there and act like I've committed some great crime because a maid can't handle being corrected." "I saw your hand raised," Alaric said. "I wasn't going to hit her. I have ruled this pack for 23 years, Alaric said, still in that same quiet voice. "I have seen men lie to me in every way a man can lie. I know what I saw." Damien's composure slipped further. "She is an Omega servant, father. This is beneath your attention. There are wolves starving on the border, packs at our gates, and you are going to stand in a linen closet worrying about one maid's bruised pride?" "Her name," Alaric said, "is Wren. She has served this house for 8 months. And you will learn her name, and you will remember it, because I intend for you to say it in front of the entire pack before the week is finished." Something flickered across Damien's face then, the first real crack of fear, quickly buried under a scoff. "You're not serious." "I have never been more serious in my life." Alaric left the room without another word, and Damien stood alone among the folded linens, telling himself his father was only shaken, that by morning this would pass the way everything always passed, that the crown he had been promised since birth could not possibly be threatened by something so small. He was wrong, and some part of him, deep down, already knew it. That night, Alaric did not sleep. He sat in his private study long after the candles had burned low, staring at nothing, turning the same moment over and over in his mind. He thought of his own father, a hard man who had taught him that a king protects his bloodline above all things, that mistakes made by a prince are simply managed, smoothed over, buried under enough gold and enough silence that they stop existing in the pack's memory. He thought of Ren's face, the relief when she saw him, the fear that came right after, because even relief could not fully erase the fact that she did not know, not really, whether the king would choose his son over her. That question sat like a stone in his chest, because for 23 years the pack had watched him make choices, and every choice had built the reputation he now carried: fair, hard, unbending, a king who did not play favorites even with his own blood. If he protected Damien now, quietly, the way his father would have, every wolf who ever whispered about the prince's cruelty would learn a permanent lesson, that some wolves in Blackthorn could be hurt, and nothing would happen, so long as the one doing the hurting had the right last name. He could not let that lesson stand. Not for Ren, not for the pack, not even, strangely, for Damien, though his son would never understand that part. Near midnight, there was a soft knock at his study door. It was Cedric, his oldest advisor, a beta who had served 3 kings before him and had learned long ago how to read Alaric's silences. "You've heard already," Alaric said, without looking up. "Word travels fast in a castle with thin walls, my lord," Cedric said. "Is the girl safe?" "She is resting. I've placed 2 guards near her quarters, though I doubt she trusts that any more than she trusts me." "Can you blame her?" Alaric let out a slow breath. "No, I cannot." Cedric stepped further into the room, choosing his next words with the care of a man who had watched kings destroy themselves and their houses over smaller decisions than this one. "There is a way to handle this quietly," Cedric said. "A generous payment, a transfer to a distant house, somewhere she'll be comfortable, somewhere she'll have every reason not to speak of it again. The prince apologizes privately, perhaps performs some act of charity the pack will hear about, and within a season, this becomes nothing more than an unpleasant memory." "That is what my father would have done," Alaric said. "It is what most kings would do." "And that," Alaric said, finally lifting his eyes to meet Cedric's, "is exactly why I will not do it." Cedric studied him for a long moment. "You intend to make this public." "I intend to make this impossible to bury," Alaric said. "If I hide this, I am telling every Omega in this pack, every maid, every worker, every wolf, with no title and no protection, that their safety depends entirely on whether the one who hurts them happens to share my blood. I built this kingdom on the promise that Blackthorn law applies to everyone equally. If I break that promise now, quietly, in a linen closet, then the promise was never real to begin with. Your son will not forgive you for what you are considering." "My son," Alaric said, put his hand on a girl who could not fight back, and told me afterward that it did not matter because of what she was born as. "I am far more concerned with what he has become than with what he will feel toward me." Cedric was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded, slowly, the way a man nods when he realizes an argument is already lost, and perhaps should be. "Then what will you do?" Alaric stood, moving to the window that overlooked the sleeping castle grounds, the dark shapes of the training yards, the guard towers, the distant tree line where Blackthorn's borders faded into wilder land. "Tomorrow," he said, "I will call the council, all of it, every beta, every warrior, every servant who wishes to attend, and I will do something no king in this pack has ever done." "Which is?" Alaric turned back to face him, and for the first time that night, something steadier had settled into his expression, the look of a man who had stopped deliberating and had finally decided. "I am going to let the pack decide what happens to my son," he said. "Not me, not quietly, not behind these walls. I am going to put the truth in front of every wolf in Blackthorn and let them watch what justice looks like when it is not bent to protect a crown." Cedric's eyes widened slightly. "That is unprecedented." "So was what I saw tonight," Alaric said. "An unprecedented wrong deserves an unprecedented answer." He did not sleep at all that night. He sat awake until the first gray light touched the windows, thinking not of his son, not even of the throne, but of a girl named Wren standing in a linen room with her arms raised to protect her own face, waiting to see whether anyone in that castle would choose her. By morning, word of what had happened had already begun to move through the halls the way fire moves through dry grass, quiet at first, then faster than anyone could stop it. Servants whispered it over breakfast preparations. Guards exchanged glances at the gate. By the time the sun had fully risen, half the castle already knew that something had happened in the linen room, though almost no one yet knew exactly what, or what the king intended to do about it. Wren herself stayed in her quarters most of the morning, refusing food, refusing visitors, staring at the torn shoulder of her uniform as though it might explain itself if she looked at it long enough. She kept replaying the moment the door opened, the king's face, the stillness in his voice. She wanted to believe it meant something. She had wanted to believe things before, and had been wrong. A young healer named Ellen came to check on her, gentle and quick with her hands, murmuring reassurances that did little to settle the tight knot lodged behind Wren's ribs. "They're saying the king is calling a full council," Ellen said, wrapping a light bandage around the bruise at Wren's jaw, though it barely needed one. "Tonight, everyone, even the kitchen staff." "For me?" Wren asked, and her voice cracked slightly on the word, disbelief and fear tangled together. "For what happened to you?" Elin said. "There's a difference, though I understand why it doesn't feel like one yet." Wren said nothing. She only stared at the small bandage on her wrist, thinking of every story she had heard since arriving at the castle. Stories of Omegas dismissed, blamed, quietly moved elsewhere when they became inconvenient to remember. She had learned early that surviving here meant staying invisible, and now, impossibly, the entire pack was being summoned because of her. She was not sure yet whether that made her safer or simply gave her further to fall. Meanwhile, in the East Wing, Damian paced his chambers like a caged animal, his earlier irritation curdling slowly into something closer to panic as the morning wore on and no one came to reassure him that this would blow over. His mother, Queen Sable, arrived just before midday, her face pale, her composure held together by visible effort. "Tell me you didn't do what they're saying," she said, the moment the door closed behind her. "I barely touched her," Damian said. "Father is making this into something it isn't." Sable studied her son's face for a long moment, and something in her own expression flickered. Doubt, quickly suppressed. "Your father is calling a full council tonight. Every wolf in Blackthorn will be there. Do you understand what that means?" "It means he's overreacting. It means," Sable said, her voice sharpening, "that he intends to do this in front of everyone. Publicly. Do you have any idea what that could cost you?" For the first time, real fear entered Damian's eyes. "He wouldn't strip my title over a maid. Your father built this entire kingdom on the idea that Blackthorn law bends for no one," Sable said quietly. "I have watched him refuse to bend it for warriors who saved his life, for betas who served him for decades. Do you truly believe he will bend it now, for his own son, after being caught with his own eyes?" Damian had no answer for that. He turned toward the window, staring out at the training yards below, at wolves moving through their ordinary day, with no idea that by nightfall, everything in the pack might be different. By the time the sun began sinking behind the western towers, word had reached every corner of Blackthorn territory that the king had called an emergency council, and that attendance was not merely welcomed, but expected of every wolf, beta, warrior, servant, and omega alike. Such a summons had never happened before, not in living memory, and that alone was enough to draw a crowd larger than the great hall had ever held. As evening fell, and the first torches were lit along the castle walls, Alaric stood alone in his private chambers, dressed in the formal colors of Blackthorn, staring at his own reflection in a tall mirror he rarely used. He looked, he thought, exactly like a king should look before doing something that would either save his kingdom's soul or tear it apart entirely. He thought once more of Wren's face in that linen room, of the question that had sat in his chest all night, unanswered until now. Tonight, he intended to answer it, in front of everyone. He left his chambers without looking back, and behind him, the candle he had left burning finally guttered out, as if even the room itself understood that whatever came next would change Blackthorn forever. The great hall had never held so many people at once. Wolves stood shoulder to shoulder along the stone walls, warriors in their training leathers, betas in their formal robes, kitchen staff still wearing their aprons because there had been no time to change, and near the back, clustered together for safety, a small group of Omega workers who rarely set foot in this part of the castle at all. Torches burned along every column, throwing long shadows across the crowd, and the air itself felt heavy, charged, the way it does before a storm breaks. Wren stood near the edge of that crowd, flanked by Ellen on one side and a young stable hand named Rory on the other, both of them there simply because they had refused to let her walk into that hall alone. Her hands would not stop trembling. Every face that turned toward her felt like another weight settling onto her shoulders. At the front of the hall, King Alaric stood on the raised dais where council matters were normally decided by a handful of elders in private. Tonight there would be no privacy. Beside him stood Cedric, his expression carefully neutral, and a few paces further, Queen Sable, her spine straight, her face a mask of practiced calm that did not quite reach her eyes. Damien stood alone, apart from his mother, apart from his father, dressed in his finest formal clothing as though appearance alone might soften what was coming. He kept his chin lifted, his eyes fixed somewhere above the crowd, refusing to meet anyone's gaze directly. Alaric raised a hand, and the murmuring crowd fell silent almost instantly, the way a pack falls silent when its leader demands attention. "I called you here tonight," Alaric began, his voice carrying easily across the packed hall without need for shouting, "because something happened within these walls yesterday evening that I will not allow to be buried, softened, or forgotten. Every wolf in this pack deserves to know the truth, and every wolf in this pack deserves to see how that truth is answered." A ripple of whispers moved through the crowd before settling again. "Last evening," Alaric continued, "I discovered my son, Prince Damien, in the act of harming a member of this household. A young woman named Wren, who has served this castle faithfully for 8 months, and who did nothing to deserve what was done to her." Every eye in the hall turned toward Wren. She felt the weight of that attention like a physical thing pressing against her chest, and she was grateful for Ellen's steady hand suddenly finding hers. "I want to be clear about what I saw," Alaric said, "because I know how easily such things are twisted into rumor. I saw fear in her eyes, and I saw my son's hand raised against her. I do not need further proof beyond what my own eyes witnessed, and I will not pretend otherwise for the sake of convenience." Damien's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, not yet. "There has long been an understanding in this pack," Alaric went on, "that certain wolves matter more than others, that an Omega's safety is negotiable in ways a Beta's or a warrior's is not. I have spent 23 years telling myself that Blackthorn law applies equally to all who live under it. Last night, I was forced to ask myself whether that was ever fully true, or whether I simply never had to prove it, because the wrong had never before come from inside my own family." He paused, letting the words settle over the crowd. "Tonight, I intend to prove it." He turned then, facing his son directly for the first time since entering the hall. Damien met his gaze at last, and for a moment, something almost pleading flickered across the prince's face, quickly hidden again. "Damien," Alaric said, "step forward." The prince obeyed, though his steps were stiff, mechanical, the walk of a man approaching a sentence he still could not quite believe was real. "You told me yesterday that this was beneath my attention," Alaric said, "that there were larger matters facing this pack than the treatment of one maid. I want you to say here, in front of every wolf who serves this house, whether you still believe that." Damien's throat worked. He glanced briefly at his mother, who gave the smallest shake of her head, a silent plea for caution. He looked at the crowd, hundreds of faces watching him, waiting. "I acted poorly," he said finally, the words clipped, reluctant. "I should not have raised my hand." "That is not an apology," Alaric said. "That is a description." Silence stretched through the hall. Somewhere near the back, someone shifted their weight, and the sound seemed enormous in the quiet. "I am sorry," Damien said at last, though his voice carried little warmth, more frustration at having to say the words at all than genuine remorse for what had caused them to be necessary. Alaric studied his son for a long moment, then turned back to face the crowd. "An apology," he said, "even a sincere one, is not enough to undo harm, and it is certainly not enough to prevent it from happening again. This pack has an ancient clause within its law, one that has not been invoked in generations because it was designed for exactly this circumstance. When the wrongdoer holds power, the wronged does not." He looked toward Cedric, who stepped forward, holding an old leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. "It is called the right of the wronged," Alaric said. "It grants the injured party, regardless of rank or birth, the standing to demand justice directly from the throne, and it obligates the throne to answer that demand without favoritism, without concealment, and without delay." He turned to face Ren. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath. "Ren," Alaric said, and his voice softened slightly, though it still carried across the silent crowd. "I am invoking this clause on your behalf, because I do not believe you should have to beg for what should already be yours by right. You may step forward if you are able, and you may speak if you wish to. No harm will come to you for anything you say tonight. That is my word as your king, spoken in front of every witness in this hall." For a long moment, Ren could not move. Every instinct told her to stay hidden, to let this happen without her, to avoid the 1,000 eyes now turning her way. But Ellen gave her hand a small squeeze, and Rory murmured something encouraging under his breath, and somewhere beneath the fear, something else stirred, something that had been buried under 8 months of silence and small humiliations she had never been allowed to name aloud. She stepped forward. The crowd parted for her without being asked, wolves shifting aside to let her walk toward the dais, and though her legs felt unsteady beneath her, she kept walking until she stood just below the raised platform, close enough now to see the king's face clearly, close enough to see Damien's jaw clenched tight beside him. "Speak freely," Alaric said gently. "No one here will punish you for the truth." Ren's voice, when it came, was quiet at first, but the hall was so silent that every word carried. "I have worked in this castle for 8 months," she said. "In that time, I learned quickly that there are things you do not say, complaints you do not make, because the ones who hear them are not the ones who protect you. I told myself that staying quiet was the price of keeping this position, and I accepted that price, because I had nowhere else to go." She swallowed, glancing briefly at Damien before forcing her eyes back to the king. "What happened yesterday was not the first unkind thing done to someone like me in this castle. It was simply the first time someone with the power to stop it happened to see it with his own eyes." A murmur moved through the crowd, low and uneasy, the sound of people recognizing an uncomfortable truth. "I do not know what justice looks like," Ren continued, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. "I have never been given the chance to ask for it before, but I know what it does not look like. It does not look like quiet payments and reassignments to distant kitchens, so that everyone can pretend the problem was solved because it stopped being visible. If tonight means something, I want it to mean that the next maid who is hurt in this castle does not have to wait for the king to walk down the wrong stairwell before anyone believes her." The hall erupted into low, urgent whispering, and Alaric let it run for a moment before raising his hand again for silence. "You have been heard," he said to her, and something in his voice carried genuine weight, genuine respect, the tone of a king speaking to an equal rather than a subject. "And you will be answered, not with a private payment, and not with silence, but with a change to the law itself, one that applies to every wolf who serves this house, now and after I am gone." He turned then to the crowd at large. "Effective tonight," he announced, "any wolf employed within Blackthorn territory, regardless of rank, has the standing to bring formal complaint directly to the throne without fear of dismissal or retaliation. Any wolf found to have harmed another, under color of rank or favor, will answer for it publicly, exactly as my son will answer for it now, regardless of blood or title." He turned back to Damien. "As for you," he said, and the hall fell utterly silent once more, "I have decided that a private apology and a quiet punishment would only confirm the very thing Wren just described, that some wolves in this pack are permitted their cruelty so long as it remains unseen. I will not allow that lesson to stand." Damian's face had gone pale. "Father, I am stripping your claim to the Blackthorn throne," Alaric said, and the words landed across the hall like a physical blow, gasps rippling outward from those closest to the dais. "You are exiled from the central territory, effective at dawn, and you will make your way to the border packs, where you will live among wolves who owe you nothing, and who will judge you only by what you show them, not by the name you carry." Queen Sable made a sound like something breaking, one hand flying to her mouth, but she did not step forward. "Father, you cannot mean this," Damien said, his voice cracking now, all pretense of composure gone. "I am your son, your heir. You would throw that away for a maid?" Alaric's expression did not waver, though something in his eyes suggested this cost him more than his voice betrayed. "I would throw nothing away that was ever truly mine to keep on those terms," he said. "A throne built on the unspoken rule that some wolves may be hurt without consequence was never a throne worth passing on. You are still my son, that will not change, but you will no longer be my heir, and you will leave this territory at first light." The hall remained silent for a long moment after that, the weight of what had just happened settling over every wolf present, before the murmuring began again, this time louder, wolves turning to one another in disbelief, in awe, in fear of what such a decision might mean for the pack's future. Wren stood frozen at the base of the dais, staring up at the king who had just upended his own kingdom in front of everyone, and she realized, distantly, that she did not yet know whether to feel relief or terror. Because a king who could do this to his own blood was either the most just leader Blackthorn had ever known, or he had just made an enemy powerful enough and desperate enough to burn the whole pack down trying to reclaim what he'd lost. She did not yet know which, but she suspected the whole pack was about to find out. Dawn came gray and cold over Blackthorn territory, and by the time the sun cleared the eastern ridge, Damien was already standing at the border gate with a single pack of belongings and 2 guards who would escort him no further than the tree line. He had not slept. He had spent the night in his chambers, listening to his mother argue with his father, through the thick castle walls, her voice rising and breaking in ways he had never heard before, his father's voice remaining low and steady no matter how sharp her words became. Neither of them had come to say goodbye. Only Cedric appeared at the gate, holding a small pouch of coin that Damien recognized immediately as far less than what a prince should carry into exile. "Your father says this is enough to reach the border settlements," Cedric said, not unkindly. "What you do after that is yours to decide." "Tell him," Damien started, then stopped, unsure what message could possibly reach a man who had just erased his own son's future in front of an entire pack. "Tell him, I won't forget this." "I imagine he's counting on that," Cedric said, and turned back toward the castle before Damien could respond. The walk to the border territory took the better part of 3 days, through forest paths Damien had never once needed to travel himself, always having had carriages, guards, comfort arranged before him without thought. By the second night, his fine boots had cracked at the heel, and by the third, hunger had worn away enough of his pride that he accepted food from a traveling merchant without asking what pack she served. The border settlements were nothing like Blackthorn. Here, the packs were smaller, poorer, made up mostly of wolves who had been pushed out of larger territories or had simply never had the standing to claim better land. Alliances shifted constantly. Loyalty was bought, borrowed, and broken as easily as it was given. Damien arrived with no title anyone recognized, and no reputation beyond the whispers that had already begun to travel ahead of him, whispers of a disgraced prince cast out by his own father for cruelty toward a servant. It did not take long for those whispers to reach the ears of a wolf named Garrick, alpha of a modest but ambitious pack that controlled several contested valleys along Blackthorn's western border. Garrick had spent years resenting Alaric's reforms, the way the old king had slowly dismantled the rigid hierarchies that used to keep Omegas and lesser-ranked wolves firmly beneath Beta and warrior classes. Garrick's own pack still operated under the old rules, and he had long suspected that Blackthorn's growing influence over neighboring territories would eventually force those old rules to change everywhere, whether the border packs wanted it or not. When Damien arrived at Garrick's territory, hollow-eyed and half-starved, Garrick saw not a disgraced prince but an opportunity. "You were heir to Blackthorn," Garrick said, studying the younger wolf across a fire that first evening, "and your father threw you out over a maid." "He humiliated me in front of the entire pack," Damien said, bitterness thick in his voice now, the events of the council replaying endlessly in his mind each night since. "Stripped me of everything I was born to inherit, for touching a servant who spilled something on me." Garrick's eyes glinted in the firelight. He did not correct the lie, though he suspected it was one. He had heard enough of the actual story from traveling merchants to know the truth was uglier than Damien was admitting. But truth mattered less to Garrick than usefulness, and a bitter, humiliated prince with intimate knowledge of Blackthorn's defenses, alliances, and inner politics was very useful indeed. "Your father's reforms threaten every pack along this border," Garrick said. "Omegas given standing to challenge betas. Servants permitted to speak against nobles in open council. It is chaos dressed up as justice, and it will spread if left unchecked. Packs like mine, packs that still understand the old order, will be forced to bend or broken entirely." Damien said nothing, but something in his expression shifted, recognition, perhaps, of a story he could tell himself that made his exile into martyrdom rather than consequence. "I did not come here seeking allies," Damien said carefully. "No," Garrick agreed, "but perhaps you should have." Over the following weeks, Garrick fed Damien exactly what he needed: comfortable quarters, respect he had been denied since his exile, and most dangerously, a narrative in which he was not a man who had raised his hand against someone weaker than himself, but a victim of his father's sudden, inexplicable madness, a prince cast aside for defending tradition against reckless new ideas. Damien, desperate for anything that did not require him to sit with what he had actually done, accepted that narrative eagerly, and within a season he had convinced himself of it entirely. Meanwhile, back in Blackthorn territory, life had changed in ways both subtle and enormous. Wren had been given a small but genuine position within the household staff's oversight, tasked with helping establish the practical details of the new protections Alaric had promised, working alongside Cedric to draft language that servants throughout the territory could actually use, rather than vague promises that meant nothing without structure behind them. It was strange, unfamiliar work for someone who had spent 8 months trying to be invisible, and some mornings she still expected someone to tell her this had all been a mistake, that she should return to carrying linens and stay quiet. But the work gave her something she had not expected: purpose, and slowly, something like trust, though it remained cautious, built one careful interaction at a time, rather than granted freely. "You flinch every time Cedric raises his voice," Ellen observed one afternoon, as the two of them sat together during a rare break, "even when he's only excited about paperwork." "Old habits," Wren said quietly. "You know he'd never hurt you." "I know a lot of things I don't feel yet," Wren said. "Knowing and feeling aren't the same thing." Ellen didn't push further, only nodded, understanding better than most how long it could take a body to catch up to what the mind already knew was safe. The changes Alaric had promised were not merely words left to gather dust. Within the first month, formal complaint processes were established in every major household across Blackthorn territory, with rotating oversight from wolves outside the immediate chain of command, specifically designed so that no noble family could quietly bury complaints made against their own members again. It was slow, imperfect work, resisted quietly by some of the older betas who preferred the comfort of the old hierarchy, but Alaric pushed it forward with the same unbending will he had shown in the Great Hall. Not everyone in the pack approved. At a council meeting several weeks after Damien's exile, An elder beta named Owen raised the concern that many others had been murmuring privately. "You have thrown away your own bloodline's claim to the throne," Owen said, his tone respectful but firm, "over a single incident with a servant. I understand the impulse toward fairness, my lord, but a kingdom needs stability above all else. What happens when Prince Damien returns with grievances, with allies, with an argument that his father acted rashly and destroyed the succession over sentiment rather than sound judgment?" Alaric considered the question seriously, as he considered most challenges to his rule, rather than dismissing it outright. "You are right that a kingdom needs stability," he said, "but stability built on the unspoken understanding that some wolves may be harmed without consequence is not stability at all. It is simply cruelty that has not yet been tested. I would rather face an uncertain future honestly than a comfortable one built on a lie. And if he returns with an army instead of an apology, then we will meet that when it comes," Alaric said. "But I will not govern today out of fear of a threat that may never materialize, especially not at the cost of doing what is right in front of me now." Owen did not look entirely convinced, and neither did several other elders present, but none pressed the matter further that day. The seed of doubt, however, had been planted, and it would not take much for that doubt to grow, especially as reports began trickling in from traders and travelers about unusual activity along the western border, unfamiliar wolves moving through territory that had been quiet for years, alliances forming between smaller packs that had previously kept their distance from one another. Alaric heard these reports and said little, though those closest to him noticed he had begun spending more time at the border watchtowers, more time in quiet conversation with his warrior captains, a young but capable leader named Finn chief among them. "You believe he's building something," Finn said one evening, as the two of them studied a map spread across a long table in the war room. "I believe my son has never once in his life accepted a consequence without looking for someone to blame besides himself," Alaric said. "And I believe Garrick has wanted an excuse to challenge our influence over the border settlements for years. Put those two things together, and you do not need a prophecy to guess what comes next. Should we move against them first?" "No," Alaric said. "I will not become the aggressor in a fight I did not start, not when doing so would only prove Damien's argument, that reform makes us weak, that fairness makes us vulnerable. If conflict comes, it will come because Garrick and my son choose it, not because we handed them a reason." Finn studied the older wolf for a long moment. "You still love him, Damien, I mean." Alaric did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice had softened slightly, the weight of the past weeks finally showing through the composed exterior he wore in every public appearance. "He is my son," Alaric said. "I will love him until the day I die, regardless of what he becomes. But love does not mean protection from consequence, and it certainly does not mean silence in the face of harm done to someone weaker. I made my choice, knowing it might cost me everything I hold dear, including him. I do not regret it. I only grieve what it has already taken." Finn said nothing further, only nodded, understanding that some burdens a king could not share, even with those closest to him. As autumn deepened into winter, tensions along the border continued to rise. Small skirmishes broke out between minor packs allied with Garrick and Blackthorn patrol units. Nothing large enough yet to be called open conflict, but enough to keep every warrior on edge, enough to make merchants nervous about traveling the western roads. Rumors spread that Damien had been seen training alongside Garrick's warriors, learning combat forms he had never bothered to master as a pampered prince, driven now by something sharper than duty, something closer to obsession. Ren heard these rumors along with everyone else, and found herself troubled by a feeling she could not quite name. Not fear exactly, though fear was certainly part of it, but something closer to guilt, an irrational sense that the growing unrest along the border was somehow connected to the choice she had made that night in the Great Hall, speaking up when she could have stayed silent. She raised this feeling once with Cedric, hesitant, unsure how such a confession would be received. "If there is conflict," she said quietly, "if wolves are hurt, or worse because of what happens along that border, some part of that will be because I spoke that night instead of staying quiet. Cedric looked at her with something like gentle exasperation. Do you believe the prince's cruelty began the night the king caught him? Do you believe Garrick's ambitions were born from your testimony, rather than years of resentment that existed long before you ever set foot in this castle? No, Wren admitted, but there is no version of this story, Cedric said firmly, where your silence would have prevented conflict and only your voice created it. Men like Damian and Garrick do not need an excuse to seek power and cruelty. They only need an opportunity, and they would have found one eventually, with or without you. What you did was refuse to let that cruelty remain hidden. That is not the same as causing what follows. Wren wanted to believe him. Some nights she nearly did. Other nights, staring at the dark ceiling of her small quarters, she found the doubt creeping back regardless of logic, the particular ache of wondering whether speaking the truth had been worth whatever price the pack might yet pay for it. She did not know, not yet, that the price was closer than anyone in Blackthorn realized, and that within weeks, the quiet tension building along the border would finally break into something the entire pack could no longer ignore. The messenger arrived at the castle gates just before midnight, half frozen, having ridden without rest from the western watchtowers. Finn met him in the courtyard, and within minutes, the entire castle had been roused, torches lit, warriors called from their beds. Garrick's forces are moving, the messenger said, still catching his breath. Not skirmishing this time. A full advance, 3 valleys inward, and Prince Damian rides at the front of them. Alaric received the news in his study, standing very still as Finn relayed every detail. Cedric stood nearby, his face grim, and Queen Sable, who had insisted on being present despite the late hour, pressed a hand to her mouth but said nothing. How many wolves? Alaric asked, his voice even despite the circumstances. Estimates suggest close to 200, my lord. Garrick has drawn support from at least 4 smaller border packs. They claim to be marching to correct what they call the corruption of Blackthorn law. They are using the prince's exile as their reason. And Damian himself? Riding at the front, my lord, as I said, wearing Blackthorn colors, though modified, some kind of banner combining our crest with Garrick's mark. It appears intended to suggest he still holds legitimate claim to speak for this pack. Alaric closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, whatever grief had flickered there a moment before had been folded away, replaced by the steady calculation of a king facing a genuine threat to everything he had built. Assemble the council, he said. Full attendance, immediately, regardless of the hour, and send word to Wren. I want her present as well. Sable's head snapped up. Why would you need the girl at a war council? Because this conflict exists in the shape it does, specifically because of what happened to her, Alaric said, and because I have learned that decisions made without the voices most affected by them tend to go badly for everyone eventually. She has earned a place in this room, and I intend to give it to her. The council assembled within the hour. The same great hall that had held Damian's exile now filled again, though this time the mood carried none of the shocked disbelief of that earlier night, only tense, focused urgency. Warriors stood ready near the doors. Elders whispered among themselves, and near the front, Wren stood at Cedric's side, uncertain why she had been summoned but sensing, from the gravity in every face around her, that this was not a night for hesitation. Alaric addressed the hall directly, without preamble. Garrick has moved against our western border, with my son riding at the head of his forces, he said. This is no longer a private family matter. This is an act of aggression against Blackthorn territory, using my earlier decision as its justification. I want no confusion in this hall about what that decision was and was not. He looked out over the assembled crowd. I did not exile my son because fairness makes us weak. I exiled him because cruelty unchecked, even when it comes from someone we love, corrodes everything a pack claims to stand for. Garrick would have you believe this conflict exists because I destroyed tradition. I tell you plainly that this conflict exists because a man who wanted power found a convenient excuse to seek it, and my son, unable to accept the consequences of his own actions, gave him that excuse willingly. Murmurs moved through the crowd, uneasy but attentive. "We will not meet this aggression with panic," Alaric continued, "nor will we meet it by abandoning the changes we have made. Garrick's argument depends entirely on convincing both his forces and ours that fairness and strength cannot coexist. We will prove that argument false, not with words alone, but by defending this territory precisely because we are the pack, willing to protect every wolf within it, regardless of rank." Owen, the elder beta who had raised concerns weeks earlier, stepped forward now, his expression troubled but no longer skeptical, rather grave with the weight of what was coming. "What do you require of us, my lord?" "Full mobilization of our border defenses," Alaric said. "Finn will lead the primary response. I want Garrick's forces stopped before they reach the second valley, if possible, though I do not intend for this to become a slaughter if it can be avoided. Damien is still my son, and I will not have him killed if there is any way to prevent it, whatever else he has become." "And if he cannot be captured without bloodshed?" Finn asked quietly. Alaric's jaw tightened. "Then you will do what must be done to protect this pack. I will not ask my warriors to die trying to spare one man's life, even if that man is my own blood. But I ask you to try, Finn, for whatever it is still worth." Finn nodded, understanding the weight of what his king was asking, and the pain buried beneath the steady request. As the council began organizing the details of the coming response, Ren found herself standing near the edge of the dais, watching the controlled chaos of preparation unfold around her, warriors receiving orders, messengers dispatched to outlying settlements, supply lines organized for what might become a prolonged conflict. She felt strangely disconnected from it all, as though watching events that had been set into motion by her own testimony, now unfolding into consequences far larger than she had ever imagined possible. Alaric noticed her standing apart and crossed to her once the immediate flurry of orders had been given. "You look troubled," he said quietly. 200 wolves are marching because of what happened to me," Ren said, unable to keep the words contained any longer. "Because I spoke that night instead of staying silent." "No," Alaric said firmly, echoing what Cedric had told her weeks before, though hearing it now from the king himself carried different weight. 200 wolves are marching because Garrick has wanted to challenge Blackthorn's influence for years, and because my son could not accept responsibility for his own cruelty. What you did that night was refuse to let injustice remain comfortable and hidden. That refusal did not create this conflict. It only revealed a fracture that already existed, one that would have found some other excuse to break open eventually, if not this one. How can you be so certain? Because I have ruled this pack for 23 years, Alaric said, and I have watched ambitious wolves search for excuses to seize power since long before you ever arrived in this castle. Garrick did not need you to want what he wants. He simply needed an opportunity, and my son, in his refusal to accept consequence, handed him one. The responsibility for that belongs to them, not to you. Ren wanted to believe him fully, and found, standing there in the torchlit hall with warriors moving purposefully around them, that she believed him a little more than she had before. The following days passed in tense preparation, Blackthorn's forces moving toward the contested valleys under Finn's command, while Alaric remained at the castle, coordinating supply lines and diplomatic efforts to prevent other border packs from joining Garrick's cause. Several smaller packs, wary of being caught on the losing side of a conflict with the much larger Blackthorn territory, quietly withdrew their support once it became clear that Alaric intended to respond with organized strength rather than panic. Garrick's forces reached the second valley 4 days after the initial advance, only to find Finn's warriors already positioned along the high ground, a defensive position that immediately shifted the balance of the coming confrontation in Blackthorn's favor. Messengers went back and forth between the two forces over the following 2 days, Finn attempting to negotiate a resolution that would avoid open bloodshed, while Garrick, increasingly aware that his numbers were insufficient against Blackthorn's prepared defense, grew more desperate to force a decisive confrontation before his temporary allies lost their nerve entirely. Damien, watching this unfold from within Garrick's camp, found himself increasingly uneasy as the reality of the situation settled in. He had imagined, in the weeks since his exile, a triumphant return, an army at his back forcing his father to acknowledge the mistake of exiling him. He had not imagined standing on the losing side of a confrontation that was rapidly becoming clear even to him, watching wolves he had convinced to fight on his behalf, facing the very real possibility of dying for a cause built on his own wounded pride. "They outnumber us in position, if not in raw numbers," Garrick admitted grimly, studying the valley below, where Finn's warriors held the high ground. "We will lose more wolves taking that ridge than we can afford to lose." "Then we retreat," Damian said, though something in his voice suggested he already suspected the answer. "Retreat now, after marching this far, and every pack along this border will remember Garrick as the Alpha who blinked first," Garrick said coldly. "I did not build alliances for years, only to abandon them at the first sign of difficulty. We attack at dawn, whatever the cost." Damian said nothing further, but that night, alone in his tent, staring at the same stars that had once shone over the castle he had called home his entire life, something in him finally cracked open, the anger and self-pity he had nursed for months giving way, however briefly, to something closer to clarity. He thought of Ren's face in the linen room. He thought of his father's steady voice delivering his exile. He thought of the wolves sleeping in tents around him now, wolves who would die at dawn for a war built on his refusal to simply say he was sorry and mean it. He did not sleep that night either. But for the first time since his exile began, what kept him awake was not anger at what had been taken from him, but something closer to the beginning of shame at what he had built in its place. Dawn broke gray and silent over the contested valley, mist still clinging low to the ground, as Garrick's forces began their advance up the ridge where Finn's warriors waited, weapons ready, faces set with the particular calm that comes before violence too many wolves had already braced themselves to face. Damian rode near the front, as he had every day of the march, but something in his posture had changed since the previous night, a stiffness that had nothing to do with battle readiness and everything to do with the argument he had been having with himself for hours. As the ridge came into clearer view through the thinning mist, and he could make out individual faces among Finn's warriors, wolves he had grown up alongside, trained beside, shared meals with before his exile, the weight of what was about to happen settled over him with sudden, crushing clarity. "Hold," Damian said, loud enough for the wolves nearest him to hear. Garrick turned sharply. "We are committed. There is no holding now." "There is," Damian said, and pulled his horse to a stop directly in the advancing line's path, forcing the wolves immediately behind him to slow or risk trampling their own prince. "I will not watch wolves die for my pride." "Your pride is the entire reason we are here," Garrick snapped. "Then let it end the same way it began," Damian said, and before Garrick could stop him, he spurred his horse forward, alone, up the remaining slope toward Finn's waiting line, both hands raised to show he carried no weapon. Finn's warriors tensed, several raising bows, but Finn himself held up a hand, watching the approaching prince with careful, measured suspicion. "That is close enough," Finn called out, when Damian had closed half the remaining distance. Damian stopped his horse and dismounted slowly, deliberately, showing every movement clearly. "I have not come to fight," he said. "I have come to end this before it starts." "Your actions the past season suggest otherwise." "My actions the past season," Damian said, and something in his voice cracked slightly, "have been the actions of a man too angry and too proud to admit what he actually did wrong. I built an army out of wounded pride and let 200 wolves march toward death because I could not stand to hear myself named a fool, let alone something worse." Behind him, Garrick's forces had come to a full stop, uncertain, watching this unexpected scene unfold with the same confusion gripping Finn's own warriors. "Send word to my father," Damian continued, raising his voice now so it carried across the valley to both waiting forces. "Tell him his son finally understood what he was trying to teach that night in the linen room. even if it took an entire army marching toward slaughter for the lesson to land. Finn studied him for a long, tense moment, weighing the possibility of deception against the raw, unguarded look on the prince's face, a look that bore little resemblance to the cold arrogance Finn remembered from before the exile. "Lay down whatever claim you still hold to leadership of this force," Finn said finally, "and order your allies to withdraw. Do that, and I will send word to the king myself." Damien turned back to face Garrick's assembled forces, hundreds of wolves who had followed him into this valley, believing his cause was just. For a moment, he said nothing, simply looking out at all those faces, some familiar from the border settlements, some strangers who had joined for reasons of their own, all of them waiting now for direction that would determine whether this day ended in bloodshed or retreat. "I was wrong," Damien called out, his voice carrying across the valley with a clarity he had not managed since his exile began. "I told myself this war was about tradition, about fairness making us weak. It was never about that. It was about my own refusal to accept that I had done something cruel and unforgivable, and my unwillingness to face what that meant without trying to burn down everything my father built instead. I will not ask any of you to die correcting a mistake that was mine alone to carry." A long silence followed, broken only by the wind moving across the valley grass. Garrick's face had gone dark with fury. "You would abandon this now, after everything." "I would end it now," Damien said, turning to face him directly, "because it should never have begun. You did not build this army out of loyalty to me, Garrick. You built it because you saw an opportunity in my anger, and I was too blind with my own wounded pride to see it until wolves were standing on this ridge ready to die for it." Whatever Garrick might have said in response was cut short as, one by one, wolves throughout his assembled forces began lowering their weapons, several visibly relieved, the tension of the past days finally breaking as word spread through the ranks that the prince himself had called an end to the conflict. Whatever loyalty Garrick had commanded had always been built on convenience and shared resentment rather than genuine devotion, and it dissolved now as quickly as it had formed, wolves beginning to disperse back toward the border settlements they had come from, unwilling to march further into a war their own supposed cause had just publicly abandoned. Garrick, seeing his forces evaporate around him, made one final furious attempt to rally them, but the moment had already passed, and within the hour, what had been a force of 200 had dwindled to a handful of Garrick's most loyal wolves, too few to pose any further threat to Blackthorn's defended position. Finn sent riders back to the castle immediately, and by the following evening, Alaric himself arrived at the border encampment, having ridden through the night the moment word reached him. He found his son sitting alone near a small fire at the edge of Finn's camp, no longer wearing the modified Blackthorn colors he had ridden in with, stripped now of any pretense to authority he had never rightfully carried. Neither man spoke for a long moment. Alaric simply looked at his son, taking in the changes the past season had carved into him, the hollowness around his eyes, the absence of the arrogant certainty that had once defined every word he spoke. "Finn tells me you ended this yourself," Alaric said finally, "before it became a slaughter." "I built an army to prove you wrong," Damien said quietly, staring into the fire rather than meeting his father's eyes. "And when I saw those wolves ready to die for it, I understood, finally, what you were trying to show me that night. That some mistakes cannot be argued away, they can only be owned, or they destroy everything around you while you keep pretending otherwise. That is the first honest thing you have said to me since this began," Alaric said. Damien looked up at last, and something raw and unguarded showed in his expression, the look of a man who had spent months building walls around a truth he had finally been forced to face. "I am not asking to be forgiven, Father. I am not even certain I deserve it. But I wanted you to know that whatever happens to me now, I understand why you did what you did that night. I did not understand it then, I understand it now." Alaric studied his son for a long moment, weighing the weight of everything that had happened since that evening in the linen room, the exile, the conflict, the wolves who had nearly died because one prince could not accept a simple, difficult truth about himself. "You will not return to Blackthorn as heir," Alaric said finally. "That claim ended the night I made it end, and nothing that has happened since changes that. But you may return, if you wish, not as a prince, but as a wolf willing to work toward becoming someone worth the name you were born with. That choice belongs to you now, not to me." Damian nodded slowly, something like relief and grief mixing together in his expression. "I would like that, though I understand it will take more than words to prove I mean it." "It will take years," Alaric said honestly. "Possibly longer. I will not pretend otherwise, and I will not shield you from the consequences of what you have done. Not this time, not ever again. But a wolf willing to begin that work is not the same wolf I found in that linen room, and I am willing to let you prove which one you have chosen to become." Back at Blackthorn Castle, word of the conflict's peaceful resolution spread quickly, and the pack's relief was matched only by growing awe at how the entire crisis had unfolded. A war nearly started by one prince's pride, ended by that same prince's unexpected choice to face what he had done rather than let others die defending his refusal to accept it. Ren heard the news from Cedric, standing in the same small office where she had spent the past season helping build the protections that had, in their own strange way, helped set this entire chain of events into motion. She felt no triumph at the news, only a quiet, complicated relief, the sense of a story finally settling into something resembling resolution, though not the kind anyone could have predicted when it began. Weeks later, at a much smaller council gathering than the one that had first exiled him, Damian returned to Blackthorn territory, not as a prince, but as an ordinary wolf, willing to begin the long work of rebuilding trust he had shattered. He sought out Ren before he sought anyone else, finding her in the small garden behind the castle's east wing, where she often took her rare moments of quiet. "I do not expect you to forgive me," he said, standing several respectful paces away, his voice carrying none of the arrogance she remembered from that night in the linen room. "I only wanted to say, directly, without excuses this time, that what I did to you was wrong, and I am sorry, not because I was caught, but because I finally understand what it cost you." Ren studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the cruelty she remembered, finding instead something quieter, something that looked, for the first time, like genuine shame rather than wounded pride. "I accept that you mean it," she said finally. "Whether I forgive you is something that will take longer than one conversation to answer honestly. I would rather tell you the truth than something easier that isn't real." "That is more than I deserve," Damian said, "but it is more than I expected, and I am grateful for it." He left her there in the quiet garden, and Ren remained for a while longer, watching the late afternoon light move across the castle walls, thinking of everything that had unfolded since the night she had raised her arms to shield her face in a linen room, never imagining that moment would eventually reshape an entire kingdom's understanding of what justice owed to every wolf within it, regardless of rank or birth. In the seasons that followed, Blackthorn's reforms held firm, tested but not broken, by the conflict that had nearly torn the territory apart. Alaric continued ruling with the same unbending fairness that had defined his reign, now strengthened rather than weakened by having proven, in the hardest possible way, that the changes he had made were not mere sentiment, but principle, worth defending even against his own blood. Ren remained at the castle, her role growing steadily as the protections she had helped establish became simply the way things were done in Blackthorn, no longer remarkable, no longer requiring explanation, simply the ordinary expectation that every wolf within the territory deserved safety regardless of the rank they were born into. And somewhere along the border, in a modest cabin near the settlements where he had once marched an army toward war, Damian began the slow, difficult work of becoming someone worth the forgiveness he had not yet earned, understanding now, finally, that some lessons cannot be taught through words alone, only through the long, patient work of proving, day after day, that a person has genuinely changed. The pack remembered that year for many things: the night the king caught his own son, the council that shocked every wolf present, the war that nearly began, and the choice that ended it before the first true blow was struck. But most of all, They remembered it as the year Blackthorn finally proved, through the hardest possible test, that its promise of fairness had never been empty words, and never would be again.